In this video, we're going to look at two more theorems that we can use in proofs, so two more mini proofs. So the first one here is called the congruent supplements theorem, and it has to deal with supplementary angles. Remember, supplementary angles are angles that add to 180 degrees. So let's just make a note here. So this is angles that add to 180. And if you look at what's given, it's telling us that in this picture we have supplementary angles. So 1 and 2 are supplementary, 3 and 4 are supplementary. This piece right here does not have to be given. You could look at this from the diagram. So if this wasn't given to me, I could just look at my diagram here and say that 1 and 2 are supplementary, so are 3 and 4, because angles that form a line are supplementary. So this does not have to be given. So you can conclude this from the diagram as well. So just be aware of that. But in this particular situation, it's given. And then it does tell us that the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 4. So I could look at that. And if you look at what we're trying to prove that angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. So think about this for a minute, and you want to believe it before you try to prove it. So if these two angles are supplementary, they add to 180. If these two angles are supplementary, they add to 180. And let's just say for a minute that if 2 and 4 are equal, let's just pretend that they both equal 100. Well, then that means that 1 and 3 have to equal 80, since that both pairs add up to 180. So it makes perfect sense why this is true. It's just a matter of how do you write it up for the general case, meaning for any number. So if I look at how I write it up, I'm going to write my givens down. So I have the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 4. Notice that I'm using equals instead of congruent because I have the M in front, which stands for measure. If you wanted to, you could switch it to congruent, but then you would drop the M. And then I have 1 is supplementary to angle 2, and 3 is supplementary to angle 4. So I just group those together since it's basically the same given. And then from here, what I can conclude is that since I have two angles that are supplementary to congruent angles, those two angles have to be congruent. So basically, since 2 and 4 are equal and 1 and 3 are supplementary to those two congruent angles, that means that 1 and 3 have to be equal to each other. So the measure of angle 1 has to equal the measure of angle 3. And the reason for that is the congruent supplements theorem, which basically states, so I'm going to go up top here and just write it, angles that are supplementary to congruent angles are congruent. So angles that are supplementary to congruent angles are congruent. So meaning 1 and 3 are supplementary to 2 and 4, which are congruent. So that makes 1 and 3 congruent. That's what the theorem says. So you can write it out, you can explain it, or you could just write the congruent supplements theorem. So then we have the same thing, but for complementary. So the complementary theorem, remember that complementary angles, so let me go back up top here. Let's just say for complementary, these are angles that add to 90 degrees. So for that, you can't just assume that from the diagram. You have to be given right angles, or you have to be told that you have complementary angles. So meaning, if you look at this picture here, I know that these are complementary because it tells me. You can only conclude this from them telling us, or if we know we have right angles. So I'm going to make a note of that. Only conclude this if you're given right angles. So you either have to be told that they're complementary, or you can only conclude it if you're given right angles. So for example, if they said that these two angles were right angles, So if I saw a marking that those are right angles, well, then that means that I could say, well, 1 and 2 are complementary and 3 and 4 are complementary because angles that form right angles are complementary. So you could say that, but you have to know that you have right angles. You can never imply or assume right angles without being told perpendicular lines or right angles first. Unlike straight angles, you can always assume that straight angles add to 180. So just be aware of that. So then the complements theorem goes like this. So we have angles 2 and 4 are congruent. So let's go ahead and write that. So angle 2 is equal to angle 4. The measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 4. We have complementary. Angle 1 is complementary to angle 2 because that was given. But also keep in mind, if it wasn't given, if you had the right angles, you could make that statement. And then from here, since you have angles 1 and 3 are complementary to congruent angles, that means that 1 and 3 have to be congruent to each other. So now I can say that the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 3 by the congruent complements theorem. Which again, remember what that really means. So let's just write it underneath. Angles that are complementary to congruent angles are congruent. So my angles, so 1 and 3 are complementary to 2 angles that are congruent. That makes 1 and 3 congruent. And so in my picture here, I can say that 1 and 3 must be congruent because since 2 and 4 are the same and these angles add to 90, that forces 1 and 3 to be the same. So think about it for a second with numbers. If 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 both add to 90, and let's say 4 and 2 are both 50, well, that means that 1 and 3 would have to be 40. So it forces them to be equal. So that's how the complements and supplements theorem works. So it's just another little mini proof that we can add into larger proofs with triangles.